This episode of Principal Center Radio is brought to you by the Project-Based Learning Network. Dr. Amy Bader, the director, is a professional curriculum writer and the leading expert on standards-based PBL. She trains teachers how to write high-quality PBL units in the Project-Based Learning Curriculum Developer Certification Program, and she teaches leaders how to implement successful PBL initiatives in the Project-Based Learning Instructional Leader Program. Learn more at principalcenter.com/PBL.
Welcome to Principal Center Radio, helping you build capacity for instructional leadership. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center, Dr. Justin Bader.
Welcome, everyone, to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to welcome back to the program Dr. Barbara Oakley. Barbara Oakley, PhD, is Professor of Engineering at Oakland University and is the author of numerous books and articles, including Learning How to Learn and Uncommon Sense Teaching, Practical Insights in Brain Science to Help Students Learn. And she teaches the world's largest MOOC, or Massive Open Online Course, entitled Learning How to Learn, now with over 4 million registered students. And she's one of several authors of a new paper called The Memory Paradox: Why Our Brains Need Knowledge in an Age of AI.
And now, our feature presentation.
Barbara, welcome back to Principal Center Radio.
Justin, it's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you about this paper, which is ultimately going to be a chapter in a book on some related topics. I wonder if we could start just by talking about what need you saw for this paper, this chapter. What were we getting wrong as a field when it comes to the relationship between knowledge and learning in an age of AI?
So I think the thing for me is that I travel and speak all over the world. So that means like several dozen countries in like the last 18 months. And what you begin to see are patterns about how different countries' education systems are unfolding and how their students are doing. And it's one thing to look at a graph and to see PISA scores, and that is worthwhile. But it's another thing to actually physically go to countries and hear of people's complaints. So, for example, for me, I was shocked. I went to Finland, and the science, technology, engineering, and math professors kind of clustered around me and said, you know, what do we do? Because Finnish nursing students can't even understand the basics about math. And what they're doing are things like they might make a mistake when they're typing a number in to multiply something out so they can give a medical dosage. And if they type, for example, 10 times 10, and they accidentally get 1,000 instead of 100, there's nothing internal that they know of that goes, wait a minute, this is a wrong number, and maybe I shouldn't be giving that amount of morphine to my patients. And what is going on here? As it turns out, there are certain teaching methods that take people backwards in their ability to learn, as we discovered during Oakley, the largest research study ever done in the field of education. And this study, which was conducted back in the 70s, it was conducted with over $100 million worth of work, tens of thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of students, and it found that direct instruction, meaning a mixture of giving students the ability, like direct practical lecture, plus the ability to actively grapple with the material, that back and forth mixture was by far the best way to teach students. Yet that result was hidden because it's so outshone all the other methods being investigated that none of the other people wanted that kind of result out there.
I think you must be talking about project follow-through. Is that right?
Exactly right. And what this paper is about, why are IQ scores falling in Western countries around the world? Note, it's not all countries. It's only advanced industrialized countries. And as it turns out, it's the advanced industrialized countries that have grabbed and embraced, with all good conscience, the idea that constructivist, student-centered approaches are the best way for students to learn. But if you think about it this way. Let's put a bunch of students in a classroom and say, okay, you figure out French for yourself. It doesn't work very well. You need to have teachers. And it's even worse with mathematics. In some schools in California, they actually have teachers walk around with their hands behind their backs, not able to say a word to help guide students in their learning of mathematics. And the bottom line is, it took thousands of years for people to even come up with the idea of the zero. I mean, it's really hard. Neural space is extraordinarily high dimensional. There are over 100 trillion synaptic connections in the brain. So that means when you're telling students, well, okay, now you need to put it together, you're like dropping them off blindfolded in a desert and saying, okay, good luck finding your way out of this. What students need, yes, is to put the ideas together themselves, but they need very careful guidance to get really close to the neurological space where they can actually see what the connection should be and have the feeling of putting it together themselves.
You have a figure toward the end of the paper entitled Educational Giants of the Past, What They Got Right and Wrong. And every single person listed in this figure, Benjamin Bloom, Jerome Bruner, John Dewey, Maria Montessori, Jean Piaget, B.F. Skinner, and Lev Vygotsky, every single one of those names is taught in almost every teacher education program. Like, everyone will recognize those names, and yet almost no one coming out of a teacher education program will recognize the study that you mentioned earlier, Project Follow Through. And I wonder if at this point distinguish between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge, because I think a lot of the intuitive appeal of the approaches championed by Maria Montessori and John Dewey, kind of the discovery learning and the ideas of constructivism, a lot of those have intuitive appeal to us because they're correct to some extent when it comes to biologically primary knowledge. Do I have that right?
Exactly right. Here's what is currently a real challenge in education, and that is that educators and psychologists are afraid of neuroscience. Neuroscience is not an easy discipline to grasp. And so what often happens, though, is it's pretty easy to do a little bit of soft shoe and be able to present results in psychology or education and have them be very factual appearing, even when they're not. And as it turns out, that in the field of education, that is the worst of all disciplines of all sorts. It is, and insofar as what percentage of studies are replicated. That simply means that somebody went and checked what you did to see if they could independently perform the same study and get the same results. In fact, 0.13% of all educational studies are replicated. That's like a vanishingly, like 1 in 1,000 maybe is replicated. And even of those that are replicated, half the time the replication team is formed by the doctoral students of the original people who did the study. What are they going to find? Of course. And then many of these studies are simply surveys, and then teachers will say, my students were really happy learning in my class. Well, of course they might have been happy, but they might not have been learning math or learning whatever you're teaching. So it's really a problem in that there's so much really bad research out there. And because schools of education are not taught, and they don't teach teachers how to look askance at research studies, we get these fads that emerge left and right. One of the newest fads coming at you your way is teach children math with them standing up and writing on a vertical surface, and they will learn math better. That's like, come on. There is so much more you can do to help students learn math better. But it sounds so easy and sounds so good. And then there are so many groups that they'll make money off of educational systems. Think about it. When you hear from a Google scholar, you can always just look it up. What's the motivation behind saying that? You can always look it up on Google. But so from the 1930s to the 70s, there was something called the Flynn effect, where IQ scores were found to rise throughout that period. And it looks as if there was really an increase in cognitive abilities. And what researchers found was, hey, that's because of education, better education methods. But from the 70s to today, those IQ scores in Western countries only have been declining. And people have thought, well, it's got to be TikTok and all these other kinds of things. But they're not looking and comparing different countries that don't use largely constructivist and student-centered approaches. And when you begin looking and comparing countries in that way, you begin to find, wait a minute, perhaps it is these student-centered approaches that are really, it just amazes me. I go to Saudi Arabia, for example, to a great conference on creativity and learning. And I'm sitting there listening, and I swear, the guy who's presenting about all the innovative breakthroughs using student-centered learning and having groups get together. So I could have heard that all exactly 30 years ago, and it would have been precisely the same presentation 30 years ago. And I'm like, haven't you learned anything? They're all coming up with these seemingly great ideas. But what is important is that some countries are really, they are getting past the fluff of stuff that doesn't work. And these countries are really educating their students very well. When I look in my College of Engineering or, that I'm at, or schools of engineering, math, science all over the U.S., my colleagues in these schools are, by and large, 80 to 90% from countries that still value at least some modicum of rote learning, getting knowledge really inside of you. And in this day and age of AI, those who do not incorporate that into their education system are going to really be in trouble.
Yeah. And you address in much more technical and professional terms an intuition that I think a lot of us have, and that is the concern that AI is making us dumber, or even prior to AI, that technology and the ubiquitous access to tools that make thinking easier are essentially making us dumber because they're saving us from the very cognitive effort that makes us smarter, that produces learning, that raises IQs, as we saw in the early 20th century, and that has been kind of reversed since technology has become so ubiquitous in the second half of the 20th century on to today. To what extent is that an oversimplification, the way I said it, that technology is making us dumber? Because certainly I've heard the metaphor that you don't take a forklift to the gym to lift the weights for you. We recognize physically we have to lift the weights in order to get stronger. Does that hold mentally? And what does that picture look like when it comes to the intuition that we have that perhaps these tools are making us dumber?
That's a perceptively asked question. If you think about many doctors that you know, they are really swift in how they're thinking about things. And how, even if you have a doctor in the family, even when they're just hanging around talking family stuff, they're going to be real quick with how they're thinking about things. And part of what happens in medical school, you can't just always look it up. And in fact, if I had a doctor where they were trained with the you can just always look it up school of medicine, well, I'll tell you, I'd pretty quick get another doctor. The reality is, could I speak Mandarin Chinese if I always just looked it up using, Google Translate? In fact, I would in no way be an expert in Mandarin Chinese if I always just looked it up. You need to have these foundational sort of bricks in your own mind of knowledge in order to become an expert in anything. If, let's say, that I was the world's greatest artist, really terrific insights, very creative, and I was presented with a novel innovation coming from physics, and it was a dramatic new breakthrough. You could show that to me. I'd nod, and I would have absolutely no clue what that actually meant or how to use it. You have to have knowledge within your own brain. Here's another example. I have a friend who wrote a book, and it was a techno thriller about AI and how this nostalgia library for people to go back and look at. And it was 289 pages long. It was the most boring, turgid, horribly written, pedantic prose, predictable, every bad thing about writing you could possibly know. And I know it's bad because my friend, my longtime friend who passed away not too long ago, Cormac McCarthy, was a brilliant writer. This book was about like the anti-Cormac McCarthy. And how could he even give me such a book and ask me to read it? It was he had never internalized and read a lot of books to know what good writing actually was. And writers will often tell you, the best path to really becoming a good writer is to read a lot. But he hadn't. He had no expertise inside him. So and it over and over again, it's so amazing, especially since the 70s, since the calculator revolution, where people started saying, oh, you can always just look it up. It wasn't that always just look it up. That it's not the calculators that cause those problems. It's the fact that educators and psychologists would go around and really say, you don't need to memorize anything anymore. And that started creating really, here's the kind of problems it creates. So let's say that you don't memorize dates of history anymore, because after all, you can always just look it up. What they found is that students didn't really know that the Civil War was in the 1800s and the Civil Rights Movement was in the 1900s. And so they thought that Abraham Lincoln must have been friends with Martin Luther King. And it was a travesty because they didn't have that nice set of, a framework, historically speaking, to understand the context of what was unfolding in history. In fact, there's so much that can be done to help students remember things easier. I had a student come up to me once and he goes, how could I have flunked this test? It was a statistics test I'd given. He said, I understood it when you said it in class. It's just crazy. We've gone so overboard that conceptual understanding is the only golden key to learning, that we completely overlook the fact that if you can't remember what you learned, all bets are off. So we have gone far astray. It's something that I call a paradigm cartel in education. And that is, you can't even begin to study approaches that are not student-centered, constructivist-based approaches because they're not deemed appropriate. And I can tell you stories about it. I mean, I went to National Science Foundation with a grant I had submitted for, and program officer just drew me aside and said, you know, we don't cotton to your kind here. We don't do anything that has to do with practice or repetition in math. You might as well forget it because you're not going to get anything. And people often think an entire discipline couldn't lock the doors to things because journal editors, they will have, different views. People who disperse grants will have different views. People who are lead professors in the discipline will have different views. But I'll give you an example of a recent paradigm cartel that was uncovered, and that is involving Alzheimer's research. As it turns out, all the top players from research in the field of Alzheimer's were all on board that it had to be amyloid plaques. And so were those who gave out funds. So were those who were the journal editors. All the people at the pharmaceutical companies were making boku bucks. So even when it was glaringly apparent that much of this research was, it seems, actually based on complete and utter fraud published in top journals, who had to be dragged kicking and screaming to finally acknowledge that, yeah, there was some hanky-panky, as it seems, in the publication of some of these articles. The whole discipline was held back for over 30 years. No movement forward in Alzheimer's research because it was a paradigm cartel. And it's similar in education now. There's a paradigm cartel that, only constructivist, student-centered, discovery learning approaches are appropriate. And what that means is it's really difficult in Western countries to get viable research funded even that brings in different ideas and different approaches.
And I'm thinking specifically of math instruction and what happened in California under the California mathematics framework and the controversy around that, what happened with the delay of algebra as a course option until high school, even for students who were already in middle school. There was this, as you said, that kind of cartel of thinking that math had to be taught a certain way, that certain ideas were kind of forbidden as far as, memorizing math facts, as far as developing procedural fluency. And you actually have a graph in the paper of the use of the term rote over time based on, I think, Google Books. And it's really interesting to see how rote learning was actually a positive thing for a very long time. And then it flipped. And certainly, I think most educators today would say that if somebody is talking about rote learning, they're using it as a pejorative, right?
Bingo. It's funny, in Taiwan, there has long been a tradition of traditional approaches to teaching. But in the 90s, so much that has been beneficial for the world has come from Western sources. For example, I don't know about you, but I'm really partial to Western medicine approaches, much as it still has things to be improved with. And so much of technology advances, for good or bad, but there's definitely been advances. And so what happened in Asia was that there kind of became this thought that anything coming from the West has to be better. And so then they just took on board constructivist reform approaches to teaching, especially in math. And there was a 6-year period in Taiwan where they really incorporated these approaches. And the result was a catastrophe. They're right by mainland China. And so there's a strict comparison that they can clearly see what's going on. Like in New Zealand, they embraced constructivist approaches. So over the past 30 years, they've gone from the top to the bottom of the industrialized world in the performance of their students. But Taiwan was pretty smart about it, and they said, you know what, this is not working. So they threw it out after 6 years. And what was lucky for them was they still had a cadre of teachers who knew mathematics, had been taught it using the traditional approaches. Here in New Zealand, it's been going on for 30 years, and now it's really tough for them to find like K-5 teachers who can teach math because they're all afraid of it. What is actually going on in your brain when you're learning? That there's two completely different systems. That hippocampal system. So Daniel Kahneman had thinking fast and slow. And that fast system is the basal ganglia habitual system. The slow system is our hippocampal sort of step-by-step reasoning system. Because this is never taught hardly in schools of education, people really don't understand that these two different ways of learning are important for teachers to know about and to teach to. And so if you have that basal ganglia pattern system early on be taught things like the multiplication tables, it can kind of take over for you, and then your higher level conscious working memory declarative system can grapple with more difficult kinds of things. But if you're still figuring out, let's see, 4 times 8, what was that again? Even while you're trying to solve a more advanced math problem, you're just going to say, this is too hard for me. And it's all because you haven't trained that unconscious rote system. And so what has happened in New Zealand is they have people who just don't like math at all. And they're grappling with this enormous lack of population who can even do fundamental mathematics, much less teach mathematics at a K-5 level. And it's really been a disaster for the country as far as having poorly trained teachers and people available within the country to do higher level tech kind of topics like what people are doing in Taiwan, where there are all these chip manufacturing facilities and so forth. Really, the best thing a country can do is to harden its cognitive system and get past these schools of education, which are often like they've circled the wagons and they refuse to move forward. And it's something akin to in the States, how state legislatures have had to mandate that phonics approaches had to be taught because schools of education were so indoctrinated into the idea that, oh no, if we just read to kids, that will work. And it didn't matter what evidence you showed. So eventually the government had to step in and say, look, you will teach via phonics. And we need to be doing the same thing with math, in incorporating these basic foundational skills of what's the multiplication table. You need to know that by heart. And in fact, in this day and age of AI, I strongly feel that we need to get past this idea that memory and memorization is bad. It is not everything. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And an important way to incorporate memory into all subjects is just to ask teachers, what do you expect your students to know by heart when they walk out of this class? And to make a list in it. Language teachers can go, I got that. Yeah, here's my vocabulary list. But go ask a math teacher and science teachers, and I think you would start some wheels turning that would actually be very helpful for students.
And you explain quite a bit in the paper about how the memory works and how memories are stored physically in the brain, as well as kind of metaphorically how they're stored. And I learned some new vocabulary about neural manifolds and engrams, not enneagrams, but engrams, the physical traces a memory leaves in your brain. So I'll refer listeners to the full paper to see the diagrams and to read all of the explanations. I wanted to return, though, to the idea of biologically secondary knowledge, because, again, I think so many of the fads and the vibes that have impacted who is in our field and what ideas are acceptable in our field have to do with the correct intuitions about biologically primary knowledge. Like, there are things that very young children discover and experience firsthand and learn that way, and kind of the Maria Montessori way of thinking about the world. But there's also a different type of knowledge, biologically secondary knowledge, that has to be taught a lot more explicitly. Tell us about biologically secondary knowledge.
So David Geary came up with these theories originally back in the 90s, and I think they're extraordinarily helpful for us to begin to understand that when teachers are teaching something and your child comes home and they're complaining about what they're learning, that a parent sometimes will say something like, why can't they make it as fun as when they were 5 years old? And it's like, well, they can't make it as fun as when they were 5 years old because it's different and it's a lot harder to learn. Biologically primary learning, I like to call it the easy stuff, is things like learning to recognize a person's face or learning your native language. These are not necessarily easy things. I mean, if a grad student had their way at the university, they would be like, well, facial recognition, that's really hard. And it is really hard for robots to do, but for babies, they can learn to recognize mommy and daddy's faces within a few days. And we learn the patterns of our native language with no instruction really whatsoever. And so this is something we are naturally geared for. But then things like learning to read a book, to, read letters, not hear sounds, but read, and do mathematics. These involve concepts that Geary calls biologically secondary knowledge. And what it means is you are having to, it's a little like bonsai. A tree will grow naturally, but sometimes you have to prune it and so forth if you want it to take a certain shape. Well, to learn these biologically secondary, more difficult materials, you got to do a little bit of shaping and pruning, especially when the child is younger. And in order to be able to put neurons, like force them to grow in a way that will help you be able to do things like read. So, for example, when you are learning to read, there's a part of the sort of towards the back of your skull that recognizes faces. Well, part of those neurons that are used are actually pushed over to the right hemisphere, and other neurons in that area are boosted up to help be able to recognize letters. So you have to do this reshaping that's not natural and would not take place if it turned out that, you weren't taught to read. So it's this type of biologically secondary, more difficult material often seems to involve that hippocampus, the declarative pathway of learning. And this pathway is it's in some ways more flexible with what you're learning, and you're conscious of what you're learning. That automatic basal ganglia pathway, you're not conscious of how you learn that way. And also, it's not very flexible. So, I learned how to type using my basal ganglia. And then I can be really fast. It takes me a long time to learn to type, but then I can be really fast with it. But if my husband played with the wiring of the keys and then suddenly it was a different kind of keyboard, it would take me a long time to rewire that. And it is going to be unbelievably powerful for schools of education when they move away from, right now, if you've spent your lifetime studying the past and studying the greats like Dewey and Vygotsky and Montessori, it's really hard for you to say, well, that may not be so important for educators growing up. In fact, they may need to know much more about neuroscience, about generative AI, and about how this practically applies in the classroom. And so if you're in a school of education, it's really hard to say, oh, yeah, I'm just going to give up everything I just spent the last, I spent 10 years learning and I've spent the last 20 years teaching. So they can kind of end up being insular and not really giving what populations actually need. So the kinds of things that you're talking about here, Justin, with biologically secondary and primary, and knowing that basal ganglia pathway versus the hippocampal pathway, these are really important new insights. I mean, face it, Vygotsky couldn't look in the brain. And if he knew that his zone of, proximal development actually relates to that 85% rule of getting things right when applied to a neural space of 100 trillion connections, he would probably be rethinking his theories. And that's the kind of rethinking that we need educators to be doing right now.
Well, I'm very grateful that you have put this paper together, this chapter, and have made it available freely. So anyone can go online and read this paper for themselves and become aware of those distinctions that you just mentioned. And I'll go ahead and give you a link. If you go to principalcenter.com/memory, that will take you to the PDF of the full paper, The Memory Paradox, Why Our Brains Need Knowledge in an Age of AI. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
It's been a pleasure. It always is a pleasure to speak with you.
Dr. Barbara Oakley, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.